He walked in on his maid by mistake. What he saw changed his heart forever. Julian Westbrook had spent his entire adult life believing that control was the same thing as peace. At 39 years old, he owned more than most people could imagine owning in several lifetimes. His name appeared regularly on business magazines, always paired with words like visionary, relentless, and self-made. His private Manhattan penthouse sat high above the city, wrapped in glass and silence, a monument to everything he had achieved by keeping emotion at a safe distance. The apartment was immaculate. Too immaculate. Every surface polished, every object placed with intention, every sound muted. Julian liked it that way. Chaos belonged to other people's lives, not his. He had learned early that feelings complicated things and complications led to loss. What Julian never noticed, because he had trained himself not to, was the quiet presence that made his controlled world function. Her name was Mara Lewis. To Julian she was simply the maid. To the world beyond those glass walls, she was a 25-year-old woman who carried more responsibility than most executives twice her age. She had come to the city with one suitcase, a worn notebook, and a promise to herself that this job would not define her, only sustain her until she could reach something better. Mara woke before sunrise every day. She cleaned rooms Julian rarely used. She prepared meals he forgot to eat. She folded his expensive clothes with the same care she used to fold handwritten letters for her younger brother back home. She spoke softly, moved quietly, and made herself small in a place built for excess. And Julian barely noticed her existence. They exchanged few words. Instructions. Polite acknowledgments. Nothing more. That was how Julian preferred it. Staff existed to maintain order, not disrupt it. Not remind him of the world beyond his own. Mara didn't mind the silence. Silence was familiar. Silence was safer than being seen. The night everything changed started like any other, late, quiet, and controlled. Julian had returned from a business dinner just before midnight, his mind still racing with projections and negotiations. He loosened his tie and walked through the penthouse, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the windows. As he passed the hallway leading to the staff quarters, he noticed something out of place. A light was on. Julian frowned. Staff quarters were supposed to be dark by this hour. Everything in his home followed routines. Predictable routines. A light left on felt like disorder, and disorder irritated him more than he cared to admit. He walked down the hallway without thinking. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. He simply turned the handle and opened the door. And in that single, irreversible moment, Julian Westbrook's perfectly controlled world fractured. Mara stood inside, frozen. She had just finished changing out of her uniform, exhaustion heavy in her bones after a long day. The simple room, small, modest, human, stood in stark contrast to the luxury beyond its walls. When the door opened, her breath caught in her throat, panic flashing across her face before she could even move. Time slowed. Julian saw her fear before he registered anything else. Not embarrassment. Not shock. Fear. Pure, instinctive fear. Mara clutched the fabric she held against herself, her hands trembling as if bracing for something worse. Her eyes were wide, her posture defensive, like someone who had learned too early that apologies came faster than protection. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words tumbling out automatically. I didn't know. The apology hit Julian harder than the image itself. Because she had done nothing wrong. And yet she was apologizing. Julian stepped back as if burned. No, this is my fault, he said quickly, his voice unsteady. I should have knocked. I didn't mean to. He closed the door too fast, heart pounding louder than the city below. The silence that followed was suffocating. Inside her room, Mara sank onto the edge of the bed, shaking. Her mind raced with consequences she couldn't afford. Losing this job would mean losing everything: her income, her plans, her ability to help the people who depended on her. She stared at the door, waiting for it to open again. It didn't. Outside, Julian stood frozen in the hallway, his hand still on the door handle. The image of her face, terrified, small, apologetic, burned into his thoughts. He had built his life on power and autonomy, yet in that moment he had never felt more aware of how much power he held without meaning to. And how dangerous that power could be. That night, neither of them slept. Julian lay awake in his massive bedroom, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. He told himself it was an accident. A simple mistake. But logic failed him. Because no explanation erased the truth he had seen in her eyes. Mara lay awake too, staring into the darkness, wondering if her life had just tilted in a direction she couldn't control. She thought of her brother's voice on the phone last week, telling her he believed in her. She thought of the dreams she kept folded carefully inside herself, dreams that felt fragile now. Morning came too quickly. When Julian entered the kitchen, Mara was already there, moving with her usual quiet efficiency. Her uniform was pressed, her expression carefully neutral, like nothing had happened. "Good morning, sir," she said softly, eyes lowered. The distance between them felt heavier than the silence ever had. "Mara," Julian said, stopping himself before defaulting to authority. "About last night?" Her shoulders stiffened. "It was an accident, sir. We don't need to discuss it." Her willingness to absorb the blame made something twist painfully in his chest. "No," he said firmly. "We do. I violated your privacy. And I'm sorry." She looked up, startled. Julian Westbrook did not apologize. Yet here he was. And in that moment something shifted, small, fragile, but irreversible. Neither of them knew it yet, but that single mistake had cracked open two guarded lives. And what Julian would soon discover about the woman he had never truly seen would change everything he believed about worth, power, and respect. The more he learned about her, the smaller his world began to feel. After that morning, the penthouse no longer felt the same. Nothing had physically changed. The marble floors still gleamed. The glass walls still reflected the skyline. The silence still hummed softly through the air. But beneath it all, something invisible had shifted, like a crack forming under a flawless surface. Julian noticed it immediately. He noticed it in the way Mara moved through the apartment. Still efficient, still quiet, but more guarded than before. She kept a careful distance now, as if every step was measured, every interaction rehearsed. Her voice remained polite, her posture respectful, yet there was a tension that hadn't been there before. And it bothered him. Not because he missed conversation. Not because he craved connection. But because for the first time he was aware of someone else's discomfort in his space, and aware that he was the cause of it. Julian tried to return to his routines. Early meetings. Late nights. Endless emails. But his focus fractured easily. He caught himself listening for Mara's footsteps, noticing when she skipped meals, when she worked through breaks she should have taken. He had lived surrounded by people his entire life, assistants, executives, investors, yet he had never truly seen anyone the way he was beginning to see her. One evening he came home earlier than usual. Mara was in the kitchen, standing by the counter with a small notebook open in front of her. She didn't hear him enter at first. Her lips moved silently as she read, brow furrowed in concentration. It wasn't a cleaning checklist or grocery list. It looked academic. When she noticed him, she flinched and quickly closed the notebook. "I'm sorry, sir," she said instinctively. "I was just." "You don't need to apologize," Julian said, surprising them both. "What were you reading?" Mara hesitated. Old habits died hard. "Just notes." "Notes for what?" he asked gently. She studied his face, clearly weighing risk against honesty. Finally she sighed. "I used to study nursing. Before I came here." Julian paused. "Nursing?" She nodded, eyes lowering. "I completed 2 years. I had to stop when my mother passed. I needed to work. Someone had to take care of my brother." The simplicity of the statement struck him harder than any dramatic confession could have. "You wanted to be a nurse," he said slowly. "I still do," Mara replied, her voice soft but steady. "Helping people felt meaningful. Like I mattered." The words echoed inside him. Julian had spent his life chasing success, convinced it would bring meaning. Yet here was someone scrubbing floors to survive, still holding on to a dream built around service rather than power. "That's admirable," he said and meant it. Mara looked surprised. "Thank you." From that night on, conversations began to happen. Small at first, almost accidental. Julian asked questions he'd never thought to ask before. Where she grew up. What she missed. What she hoped for. And Mara cautiously began to answer. She told him about growing up in a cramped apartment where love was abundant but money was not. About learning to stretch meals, to study by borrowed light, to stay quiet when adults talked about bills. About how her mother had worked 2 jobs and still made time to sit beside her bed at night, reminding her that dignity had nothing to do with wealth. Julian listened. Truly listened. And the more he learned, the more uncomfortable he became, not with her but with himself. He began noticing how others treated her. The delivery drivers who spoke over her. The guests who handed her trash without looking at her face. The casual dismissiveness woven into everyday interactions. It was subtle, quiet, but relentless. And Julian realized, with a cold knot forming in his chest, that he had done the same. One afternoon he overheard a visiting executive remark, "She's lucky to work here. People like that don't usually get opportunities like this." Something in Julian snapped. "She's not lucky," Julian said sharply, shocking everyone, including himself. "She's capable." The room went silent. Mara froze where she stood, eyes wide. The executive chuckled awkwardly and changed the subject, but the damage was done. The hierarchy Julian had unconsciously upheld had been disrupted. That night, Mara knocked on Julian's office door. "I didn't ask you to defend me," she said quietly. "I know," Julian replied. "I did it because it was right." She studied him, uncertainty flickering across her face. "People don't usually do that. Not for someone like me." Julian felt the weight of her words settle heavily between them. "You shouldn't have to be invisible to survive," he said. The silence stretched. Then Mara said something that changed everything. "Being invisible is how I learned to stay safe." Julian saw then what he had missed before, not weakness but resilience carved by necessity. She wasn't fragile. She was strong in ways his world had never required him to be. But strength, he would soon learn, did not protect her from cruelty. Because not everyone welcomed the shift in his attention. Rumors began circulating. Whispers among staff. Accusations disguised as concern. One afternoon, Julian received an email from his management firm suggesting he maintain professional boundaries to avoid misinterpretation. The implication was clear. Mara was becoming a liability. And Julian, for the first time in his life, had to decide whether comfort or conscience would guide him. He hadn't yet realized that the hardest test of his character was still ahead. When the truth came out, no one could pretend anymore. The warning signs came quietly at first. An email from Julian's legal advisor. A polite but pointed reminder from his management company about optics. A suggestion, thinly veiled as concern, that live-in staff sometimes misunderstood kindness as favoritism. Julian read every word with growing anger. 4 years he had navigated boardrooms filled with sharks, hostile takeovers, and ruthless negotiations without flinching. But now, seeing Mara reduced to a risk on someone else's spreadsheet ignited something in him that no business threat ever had. Mara, meanwhile, sensed the shift before he said anything. She always did. She noticed how his phone calls grew sharper. How his jaw tightened when emails came in late at night. How conversations would stop when she entered a room if outside staff were present. One evening, as she cleared the dining table, she spoke softly. "You don't have to do this." Julian looked up. "Do what?" "Change things," she said carefully. "People like me, we don't change systems. We survive them." He stood slowly. "Who taught you that?" "Life," Mara replied, not bitter, just honest. "I've seen what happens when people step out of place." Julian felt something settle deep inside his chest. Clarity. "I built my life believing success meant control," he said. "But control without compassion is just another form of cruelty." She looked at him, then really looked at him, searching for something false. She didn't find it. What neither of them knew was that the real storm was already forming. It broke during a charity gala hosted in Julian's penthouse. A high-profile event attended by investors, executives, and media figures. Mara had worked non-stop all day, ensuring everything was flawless. As guests filled the space with laughter and champagne, she moved quietly, collecting glasses, blending into the background as she always had. Until she didn't. A guest, an influential donor, spoke loudly without realizing Julian was close enough to hear. "Staff should know their place," the woman said dismissively, gesturing toward Mara. "Giving them too much attention only encourages delusion." Julian froze. Mara stiffened but kept her eyes down. The room waited. Julian stepped forward, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Her place," he said, "is wherever dignity exists." The woman blinked, embarrassed. "Excuse me?" Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Mara is not staff, in the way you're implying. She is a nursing student who put her education on hold to support her family. She works harder than anyone in this room and she deserves respect." Silence fell like a dropped glass. Mara's breath caught. The donor flushed. "I had no idea." "That's the problem," Julian interrupted. "You didn't bother to know." The exchange spread through the room faster than gossip ever could. Whispers turned into conversations. Conversations into questions. By the end of the night, something extraordinary had happened. People were seeing Mara. Not as a maid. Not as background. As a person. The next morning, Julian made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He announced the creation of a foundation, quietly without press fanfare, dedicated to funding education for domestic workers and caregivers who had been forced to abandon their studies due to financial hardship. Mara found out last. She stood in the kitchen, staring at the paperwork he placed in front of her. "This is, for me?" she asked, overwhelmed. "For you," Julian said, "and for others like you. But you don't owe me anything." Tears filled her eyes. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. "Because I walked into your room by mistake," he said finally, "and walked out a different person." Mara returned to school 6 months later. She didn't quit her job immediately. She finished with grace. With pride. With references that spoke not just of her work ethic but of her character. Julian attended her first white coat ceremony quietly, standing in the back, clapping harder than anyone else. The world didn't change overnight. But one life did. And then another. And another. Julian Westbrook remained wealthy, powerful, successful. But for the first time, his success meant something more than control. It meant responsibility. And Mara? She became a nurse who treated every patient the way she had once wished to be treated. Seen, respected, and never made to feel small.